Hey everyone, and welcome to this session on what is the Global Forecasting School and Dynamic Learning Environment, and how are they changing because of AI. And today I'm joined by Doug Laxton, who is the director of the Better Policy Project. Doug, can you help us out?
Okay, so first of all, what is the Global Forecasting School? If you want to read about it, there's a book on our website. This is very much related to the prudent risk management approach that was developed at the Central Bank of Armenia and so on. And so they asked me to help them develop this framework. So at the time we developed this global forecasting school in this dynamic learning environment. And I would say in a nutshell, it's about teaching economists how to be economists, where you start off with policy problems. You know, instead of looking at academic models and so on, and learning that way, and then when real policy problems come, realizing that those models have little to say about those policy questions. It starts right off the bat with thinking about interesting policy problems. So a good example would be our models with endogenous monetary policy credibility, which is obviously very important for many central banks as an organizational framework. So prudent risk management approach is basically just taking what we used to call baseline centric policies and incorporating scenarios based forward guidance. You might look at a recent video presentation by Shelva, who just recently published a paper along with Heike Sigitsyan in the Oxford Economic Policy Review, and you'll get a good summary of it. Dynamic learning environment. When you think about how we learn, I think optimally, it starts off with training economists and expecting them to internalize the information on the day that you're covering that information, as opposed to training where you provide a bunch of training material and then ask them to go away and think about it. So it's much more, I would say, demanding on professional economists, because not only are they expected to know things, but they're also expected to communicate what they know very, very quickly, and so on. So that's it in a nutshell. But again, I think you can read the book that is on our Better Policy Project website. And so this is the book that describes the prudent risk management approach. So I think that's probably if you didn't fully understand what the dynamic learning environment is, take a look at the book, and I think it will give you a good idea of what it means in practice and so on.
So, do I understand correctly that if I'm an aspiring central banker and I join the Global Forecasting School, then I'm really learning not just the standard models, but really the latest models that are sort of at the bleeding edge of central banking?
I would say you're learning policy relevant models, and you're less infected by academic models that have really limited applicability. If you wanted to think about something in academia, I would think about core econ. That might be the closest approach to what we do, but what we do is far more extreme. But core econ, where it came from, is that, you know, if you looked at how undergraduates learn, maybe they are using the Mancuse textbook and so on.
Yeah.
Or they might even be using Jordi Galli's textbook in graduate work. And then something like the global financial crisis would come along, and you'd realize that those textbooks are just wrong, completely wrong, and have nothing to say about avoiding or preventing financial crises. I mean, in the standard textbook, and Bill White, one of my friends, just recently reviewed all textbooks. They have this view that somehow commercial banks, the role of them is to collect deposits and to lend them out, and that just doesn't make any sense. And it underestimates the amount of vulnerability in the financial system. What actually happens in the real world is that people go into commercial banks and ask for loans, like mortgage loans. And if they're asking for a mortgage loan and they don't get it, they can't buy a house. And so money is actually created through the process of giving loans, and at the same time they're matching bookkeeping entries on commercial bank balance sheets that they're given demand deposits or purchasing power that is then used. And if you understand what the principal causes of all financial crises are, it's the characteristic of an excessive credit expansion and asset price bubbles, particularly in the housing sector. So no, I wouldn't. It's just that the economic models in the profession are just wrong in many respects. They're linearized. Okay, most of the models in the profession are linearized, and that's just not very interesting for policy questions. Jacob Frankel, I love the way he put it. If the world was linear, it's like driving down a perfectly straight road. You can go as fast as you want, and looking out the back window provides as much information as looking out the front window. So that's not the real world. That view of the world is totally academic, and the problem is that academia, I think, has infected many policymaking institutions, because most of the research is based on these linear models that really have no pain in them. Borrowing a comment by Stephen Ingves, he was commenting on somebody applying linear models to study financial crises, and he said, how could you possibly use a linear model to study crises, because crises are all about pain, and how can you study trying to prevent pain if you don't have a model that has no pain in it? So no, I'm not sure. I don't agree. It's just that the textbooks are wrong in many respects, and academia, which I'm totally okay about, focuses on tractable linear models, and that's totally okay for academia. I'm not suggesting that they start focusing on really complicated nonlinear models, but that's what we have to focus on when we are doing policy. That linear models in many cases are just not completely uninteresting right from the get-go.
Yeah, and so what are some of the courses then that you can do at the Global Forecasting School?
Well, first of all, AI has been very important in changing the way that we teach and so on. So we have 2 courses coming out on the endogenous monetary policy credibility model and so on. One course sort of looks at the United States, and the key example of the United States would be the Volcker disinflation. So we let inflation out of the bag in the 1970s. We made some monetary policy errors. Long-term inflation expectations ratcheted up, and this inflation psychology took hold, and it took Paul Volcker increasing interest rates to almost 20% and generating a double-digit unemployment rate recession. In other words, an unemployment rate above 10%. And that was extremely costly. So that's an example of people in financial markets and the public just didn't believe that the central bank was going to try and reduce inflation to low levels. The other one was in the early 1990s. So after the Volcker disinflation, it was so costly to the economy that they only brought inflation down to around 4%. And obviously 4% wasn't really consistent with the long-term goal. 2 was. And so you had another disinflation in the early 1990s. Now what is special in endocred is that it doesn't have a reaction function. It has an objective function that has inflation and the output gap in it, or you could also have inflation and unemployment in it. And it efficiently balances these trade-off between these two objectives, subject to an economy that has a convex Phillips curve, which can give us the prediction that it could take really, really high unemployment to bring inflation down. Now, the second part of disinflations is that there's one phase where you bring inflation down, but then it can take years. You have to show that you actually deliver low inflation over an extended period of time. In the case of the United States, it wasn't until 1996 that long-term inflation expectations became anchored to 2% objective. And then, of course, once they became anchored, and this is what we build into the model, is that the inflation process becomes much less sensitive to shocks, stagflationary shocks, and so on. And so having AI, having made easier the process of solving nonlinear models, and in fact we're going to show people that you can actually do it by talking to your iPhone, that you don't have to dig into a bunch of code like we used to have to do years ago, and that has opened up the possibility of many more people getting into this thing, because in the past it was people that had to have very high tolerance for getting into code and solution methods. So we can teach everybody about solution methods now if we're doing this problem in less than a day. And once they understand that, then they're away at providing, based on different scenarios for the economy, implementing what we call the prudent risk management approach to avoid, these dark corners where you allow inflation expectations to either ratchet upwards, which was the case in many economies in the 1970s, or the opposite, where it ratchets downwards, like in the case of the euro area before COVID, or the Bank of Japan and stuff, where they just couldn't get inflation up to the 2% and so on. So we have courses coming out. Sophie and Tinatine are going to be leading these courses. The way they're taught is quite a bit different. We will just give people an account to our AI tools, as well as training material and videos and so on. They listen to it, and then they play around with the models and that sort of thing. And they do that exercise before they engage with a trainer working on an interesting problem that they care about. So the first version of that is about the U.S. The second version is about a model that we recently published in the Oxford Economic Policy and so on. And it's about a two-country model where you add the exchange rate. And so you can think about applying that to a small open economy that is interacting with a larger economy like the United States and so on. And so that application is going to be about the Central Bank of Armenia and the United States, but it can be easily extended to any open economy where you think imperfect credibility is a strong and important assumption that you really need to deal with, that you simply can't ignore and so on. We also have a course coming out on fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is is going to become very, very important. We're either going to have fiscal crises, and if we do have a fiscal crisis because of our regulatory frameworks in response to the global financial crisis, there's a lot of commercial banks, most commercial banks hold a lot of government securities on the asset side of their balance sheet. So not just loans and mortgages and so on, but they actually hold government securities. So the second that we start observing problems with default risks in government securities, we will have that second a financial crisis and so on. So if we try to avoid that fiscal crisis, it means that we need to have serious models for studying fiscal policy. And again, that's not academic models that are based on infinite horizons. We need to have, overlapping generation models that have strong non-Ricardian features. So we're going back to a lot of the work that we did in the 1990s, where we had fiscal problems and high interest rates and so on, and effectively making that stuff really easy because we have AI that's helping us to organize the way that we teach those very complicated models by effectively building them up from small pieces, like the Blanchard 1985 JPE paper on finite planning horizons, and then some extensions were incorporating things like life cycle income profiles to make them more and more plausible, and then adding more and more complexity until you get something that you could say is real enough to look at things like the short run and long run trade-offs in fiscal policy, like the short run costs of fiscal consolidation versus the longer term benefits of fiscal consolidation. So I think there's only three roads going forward. Two, we have fiscal crises, one, we have fiscal crises where they turn into financial crises, or number two, we have fiscal consolidation. In either way, we need to have models that have sensible predictions for things like what are the effects of fiscal policy. And the third, unfortunately, we go back to deflation, and that is probably also going to be associated with understanding how we can use fiscal policy to backstop monetary policy when it's at effective lower bounds. So we have that. We also have another course that Sophie and I are working on, which is about thinking about how does the financial system interact with the real economy. And so I'd done some work when I was at the IMF that focused on the asset side of commercial bank balance sheets, so endogenous credit default. But there's also a liability side where commercial banks are obviously concerned about their liquidity position. So we have, I would say, real practical models that deal now both with the asset side and risks of extending too many loans, excessive credit expansions, as well as not having sufficient liquidity provisions on the liability side of commercial banks. So those are the main courses that we're working on now. And you can check out the Better Policy Project website, and you'll be able to see when these courses are available. Nice thing is that you no longer have to sign up for a course that is going to be at some point in the future, and that you can actually just sign up any Monday and start the course, because it's all about interacting with AI, the first stage of it. And once you do that and show that you understand the material, at that point, then you start interacting with an instructor that would help you solve the particular type of problem that you're trying to solve, either endogenous monetary policy credibility, understanding how to think about fiscal policy trade-offs, or how to think about models with endogenous money creation. Okay, so those are the courses that we're working on right now, and the big important aspect of it is the fact that we've developed AI tools that allow us to do this in a much more well, it's easier for people. Now, people nowadays, they don't seem to have the patience to get into code and really complicated models and how do you solve the models. So the AI, I think, has made that much easier for us to teach how you do that in practice, and of course how you solve the models, nonlinear models, not linear models, all nonlinear models, all three of them.
All right, thank you, Doug. That sounds super interesting. For me, especially, these courses on endogenous money, endogenous credibility, and fiscal policy are indeed something that I never had when I studied economics in academia, and I think it's absolutely crucial for any aspiring central banker today. And then the fact that you're also using AI to make teaching this or learning this easier is the icing on the cake. So thank you so much, Doug, for this explanation. And I really encourage people who are watching this video to go to the website of the Better Policy Project and Global Forecasting School to have a look at these courses.
So thank you, Joeri, for engaging with us.